Hey everybody, how are you doing? John here with what promises to be the final lecture of our section of Theories 1. So, our topics for this week are obviously postmodern theories and perspective and family systems theories and perspective. So, I decided that I'm going to talk about a specific model called solution-focused brief therapy that kind of grew out of these two larger perspectives. So solution-focused brief therapy as a therapeutic model and as a kind of a set of techniques is something that we're going to discuss again next semester. And the primary reason that I chose to talk about it today is for bringing together some of the key ideas behind the two other perspectives that make up our current topic. Does that make sense? SFBT gives us a way to think about the influences of systems theory and then also postmodern perspectives. So in terms of how it works therapeutically, we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the second course in our theories sequence. So from this point on, I'm going to try and move through this fairly quickly for you. So solution-focused brief therapy grew out of a group of therapists in Milwaukee in the 80s. The main guy behind it, a guy named Steve DeShazer, is actually an alumnus of UW-Madison, which is where I did my PhD. He actually was a social worker, as you'll see. The core principles of solution-focused brief therapy is that the focus is on solutions, not problems. It's collaborative, so it's an egalitarian type approach. It operationalizes the idea that very small changes, if you kind of stack them up on top of each other, can lead to big results. There is an emphasis on the therapeutic process, on how therapy goes itself. It is an eclectic approach, but it is kind of intentionally eclectic. It's not just a hodgepodge. It is brief. It is conceptualized as being brief, but it doesn't have to be really brief. And it provides a nice modality for responding to multicultural considerations. So as I mentioned, we've got the solution-focused, collaborative approach, all of those individual characteristics, and then it's also directive, which allows it some good application in rehabilitation, right? Because a lot of times in rehab, we really are trying to help folks identify goals. So sometimes with person-centered therapy, as y'all have pointed out, the therapeutic process can be kind of ambling and not tied to specific goals. Well, solution-focused brief therapy does tie to specific goals and help to identify specific goals. So that's what's meant by directive there at the bottom of the slide. So it's a future-focused, goal-oriented approach to brief therapy that uses questions designed to identify exceptions to the problems that people are having. So someone comes to you for therapy and says, gosh, I'm here because I'm having a horrible time getting along with my spouse. We are fighting all the time. One of the things that a solution-focused brief therapist is going to do is to try and find some exceptions to that. Well, so to do that, we might ask a client, well, what does it look like when you and your spouse do get along? And through finding exceptions like this to times when problems are kind of in full force, the idea is that we help people grow the adaptive areas in their life. It makes use of scales. Those of you who are in my on-campus group know this. We ask folks to rate their progress on the way to a goal. Like let's say someone is striving for a promotion. They're trying to advance in their career. We might ask the client, okay, so if you were to rate how close you are to reaching your goal on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate it? the client then gives you a rating, and that kind of numerical value gives us a way to assess progress toward goals. Does that make sense? And there's a lot of this stuff, a lot of this scaling and kind of clever ways of asking questions. So there are a bunch of techniques that are at the center of solution-focused brief therapy that make it nice and useful to incorporate in your own eclectic approach. So it is largely known for these little techniques. However, what isn't talked about quite as much, and what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of this lecture, is the ideas behind SFBT. So yes, it's got all these cool, clever techniques, but for our purposes, what's important is where it came from theoretically. So it grew. I mentioned that the model itself was founded in Milwaukee. The schools of thought that contributed to the model grew from a group of researchers at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto in the late 50s. You don't need to be kind of struggling to write this stuff down. It's just to give you a little bit of background information. So yeah, the ideas that eventually became SFBT got started in the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, California. And that is that problems were viewed systemically. So when we consider a person's problems, we look at what that person is experiencing in terms of the interaction between the individual and the larger group, right? So it's the systemic dynamics between individuals and the larger group that provides the frame for thinking about problems. So in other words, we're not looking at the person as the problem, or we're not even looking at it in terms of the person has a problem. We're trying to look at it in terms of there's a problem that exists in the fit between the person and their environment. Individual interventions are kind of customized and tailor-geared towards individual people. There's a big emphasis on There's a big emphasis on interrupting repetitive sequences of problematic interactions. So these are pieces of systems thinking. So if you think in terms of family therapy and family problems, the idea is that a lot of times what happens that makes it so difficult for families to get along is that there are these repetitive sequences of problems. It's almost like a Groundhog Day type effect that people can't get out of. Let's say one person, the husband and father in the family, comes home from work and sighs. Immediately, everyone else in the family assumes that he is upset with them. And then they respond from there. And then this happens every single day because the father comes home from work every single day. So one of the ideas that came out of the Mental Research Institute was, how do we interrupt these repetitive sequences that don't work? The Mental Research Institute and some of the research that came out of there and thinking that came out of there was not focused on understanding why problems occur. So this is pretty radical, right? I mean, if we're to compare to, say, psychodynamic or cognitive behavioral, two very different theories, but theories that have a really clear idea about why problems occur and what problems are a manifestation of. SFBT is not as interested in why something is a problem, and we'll see how that works a little bit today and then further next semester. And I think I said this a few times, problems are conceptualized in terms of the individual within their broader system. It's a snapshot of Steve DeShazer, who's the primary founder, with his spouse, with his wife and partner, Insoo Kim Berg, who is kind of not quite a co-founder, but someone who has written a whole lot about SFBT as well. De Shazer is no longer with us, and I do believe that Kim Berg is still with us. Again, that's not hugely important for our purposes, just a little bit of background information. So Steve De Shazer was kind of a iconoclast, if you're familiar with that term, so sort of like a Rage Against the Machine kind of guy. Maybe not rage, because he's centered, calm person, but he liked the idea of kind of ironic statements and ironic perspectives, and he liked going against the status quo, and kind of presenting ideas in a way that is maybe a little confusing at first, so that we kind of think about them, if you can envision this type of individual. So what he would say is that solution-focused brief therapy is really not a theory at all. It's a theory that says, don't have a theory. In line with this, and we'll explain where he's coming from on this idea, but in line with this, well, that means that it does not have a depthful understanding of human development, say like psychodynamic or psychoanalytic. It does not elaborate on what the causes of mental health disorders are, like say cognitive behavioral does, for example. What it does grow from is De Shazer's idea that you need to follow your data and don't have a theory. And so as theorists or students of theory, we say, what does he mean, no theory? And this is where I explain that he's a little bit of an iconoclast. He likes to be kind of ironic because, well, there may not be a kind of singular, cohesive, solution-focused brief therapy theoretical framework, but it is grounded in a bunch of solid theoretical work. You can certainly see elements of cognitive behavioral, of Rogerian, and I think actually some other influences as well. So he'll say theory of no theory, but kind of take that with a grain of salt. For some more ideas about this, we look back again to the group in Palo Alto, the Mental Research Institute, and the way that they considered pathology. These researchers, through looking largely at family systems, concluded that pathology, or what we call pathology, is the result of an intersection between individual experience and a disordered society. So psychological distress is caused by the reaction between a person and a disordered social group. Well, this idea applies to the whole community, to individuals in their broader community, and the kind of worldwide sort of deal. But it grew out of looking at families and the idea of the pathology of normalcy, where the adjustment of some families to chronic internal distortions in families, where this adjustment is kind of problematic. So there's like ongoing cycles of that could be difficult and disruptive, that are really rooted in the interaction between the individual and the larger group, either the family or the broader society. And again, I keep bringing back the Palo Alto group because that's where these ideas started to take root, and they reflect systems and family theory and therapies. So that idea, the idea of problems not existing in the individual, but instead existing as a result of tension between the individual and the larger group, that is a fundamentally postmodern idea. And this is where we really get to the meat of why we're talking about SFBT, because SFBT is pretty easy to talk about. It's interesting. There's some easy things to remember. And it embodies a lot of the key ideas about postmodern perspectives that I think are important for us to kind of take away from the lecture and the course. So postmodernism is essentially, it's a category of sociological ideas, a school of sociological thought, and it's essentially a response to classical positivism. So classical positivism is an older sociological framework that informs the majority of traditional clinical models in medicine and then also in psychology type frameworks. And so these would be models that are informed by an empirical or a positivist or a realist epistemology. So there's some, nickel words in that sentence. What that really means is, to classical positivists, there does exist a unifying reality, right? There's one world. There's events occur in one way. A single event occurs in only one way. It has only one kind of true meaning. There's a single objective reality that exists, which on the one hand you're like, well, of course a single objective reality exists. Well, postmodernism, and specifically social constructionism, posits the opposite. Social constructionism indicates or tells us that each individual's subjective experience constitutes its own reality. So for social constructionists and postmodernists, you as an individual have a distinct experience that is just yours and is completely real. I have a separate experience that is just mine and is also completely real, and the two can be completely different, even if they occur on the same earth at the same time. We talked a little bit about these ideas. I'm thinking where else we talked about them in our course. They come up a lot when I talk about multiculturalism, differential of power. Probably mentioned it a little bit at the beginning when I was talking about the therapeutic relationship, and how what the client experiences in therapy is inherently different from what you're experiencing as the counselor. So again, the theory and practice of solution-focused counseling, and really postmodern counseling period, is informed by the view that knowledge, and therefore reality, is a subjective phenomenon. Term phenomenon in our literature, when someone says something is phenomenological, they mean unique to an individual. So your phenomenological experience is your unique experience. Social constructionism, postmodernism, solution-focused brief therapy put a lot of stock in this idea that your individual experience is unique and valid, and that the world tells different people different things, and that people build their reality out of these things that the world tells them. Again, to contrast with classical positivism, positivism is fundamentally informed by the scientific method. There's a single empirical, knowable, objective truth and reality, and this kind of objective reality permeates everything. There's one reality. You might have a perspective, I might have a perspective, but that we only have perspectives because we're only seeing a piece of the reality. Whereas social constructionism, on the other hand, postmodernism tells us that the phenomenological world supersedes an objective social reality. That my experience of the world is real, and that because to me it is real, it supersedes any idea about what objective reality is. And it sounds maybe a little bit goofy, but then if you think it through, well, if we're to put forth the idea that there is an objective reality, well, whose objective reality? Who is in the position, is there anyone in the position to see everything as one cohesive picture? And I think the answer, at least the answer for social constructionism, is no. There is no one who can see this all objective reality. Therefore, it doesn't exist. And the idea that it does is actually kind of dangerous to social constructionists, to postmodern thinkers, because if we're to believe there's one all objective reality, well, we're going to cast aside the experience of people that we don't understand a lot of the time. We're going to be kind of quick to correct people. Someone might tell you some story where they were treated unfairly, and our initial response might be, well, I understand that that might have happened once, but the world really isn't like that. The world is really a fair place. When in fact, for many people, the world is a fair place. The world has been, I would say, pretty fair to me, but the world has not been fair to everyone. And I think that in and of itself is not a radical idea, right? So a child who's born in a developing nation, is hungry from the minute she's born, loses her parents early in some kind of conflict, does her best, gets up early every day, tries to get the worm, isn't going to have the same result as you or I, who doesn't face those same circumstances, right? So social constructionism would say, you know what, that world that imaginary girl lives in is a world, it's a real world, and it's different from mine. So it doesn't make sense for me to try and kind of join them together and say that they're part of the same objective world. Again, I know I'm beating on this idea a little bit, but this is really a big chunk of what postmodernism is about in our field. So just kind of a little bit more about where de Shazer gets this idea. Hey, Steve, what's your main objective to having a theory? And he says, kind of ironic, a little bit iconoclastically, as I said he'll be, well, theory, in addition to offering to explain everything, also tells us what must be and or what should be, therefore getting in the way of seeing what is. So de Shazer's saying that if we go into a session with a client and we bring into the room our firm perspective as a cognitive behavioral therapist or as a psychodynamic therapist, well, we've come to that room already with sort of an unwritten plan, and we're basically just waiting to kind of unfold it, fit the client in it, and make it work for him or her. De Shazer says, no, that doesn't work. Check your framework at the door. Don't bring that in here. Now, does he really believe that there's no value for all of the theories that preceded SFBT? Probably not. But like I say, he's kind of an iconoclastic guy, or was. He passed away. An iconoclastic guy who wants to say things in a way that's maybe not controversial, but a little bit. Okay, hold on. My slide is a little stuck here. What do we got going on here? Hold on just a second. And so where did he get this idea? Where did this idea come to him? And he says, well, at some point in the mid-1980s, somebody remarked to me while we were watching a session through the mirror, so observing counseling sessions, the person that DeShazer was with says, they're not doing anything but talking in there. This casual remark led DeShazer to take the idea that talk or language is the data of counseling, and that we really need to take a good hard look at this data and this language in action. So that's what when he says have no theory and follow your data, that's what he means. He means come on in, don't have a theory, and listen very carefully to the language that your client uses. Follow your data and do not have a theory. So this, again, ties to a postmodern idea, the sociology of knowledge, kind of a big chunk of the way that DeShazer thinks. And he doesn't tell us. This quote comes from a 1966 book by some very important authors, not psychologists or psychiatrists or counselors, but sociologists. A book by a couple guys named Berger and Luckman on social constructionism. And they tell us that language is capable of transcending the reality of everyday life altogether. It can refer to experiences pertaining to finite provinces of meaning. It can span discrete spheres of reality. It soars into regions that are not only de facto, but also a priori unavailable to everyday experience. So basically what they're saying is that language is where it's at in terms of understanding people's experience of the world, people's phenomenological experiences of the world. I'll take a little bit more closer look at that here. So they go on to say, this does shift to DeShazer implementing the ideas, the postmodern ideas shared by Berger and Luckman. And he says, we draw upon two different but related perspectives in developing our approach to emotions in solution-focused brief therapy. The first perspective is derived from the sociology of knowledge. That's the Berger and Luckman ideas. And he explains that the sociology of knowledge is a field that is concerned with how different forms of knowledge are produced, disseminated, and used in a society. Come on, I apologize. There's something funky going on with my slide here. I shouldn't have to click so many times. While sociologists of knowledge differ in their theoretical and methodological orientations, most assume that different forms of knowledge are related to different social circumstances. These circumstances range from class, racial, gender factors on the one hand, to individuals' practical interests in concrete situations on the other. So if we think back to my example of the little girl born into a developing nation, orphaned at an early age, well, she's going to get different kinds of knowledge about the world than I'm going to get, right? Than I'm going to get as someone in the middle class in the United States with an education, Caucasian, male. I've learned a whole different set of tricks about the world than our imaginary girl in a developing nation. So in SFBT, and really in postmodernism more broadly, the sociology of knowledge perspective is used to raise questions about the implications of therapists' definition and use of the concept of emotions. So they walk this idea of phenomenological experience out so far that they even question the very concept of emotions. What does emotions mean? And furthermore, DeShazer puts it out there that he thinks it's absurd that therapists have constructed a whole professional field of emotions that treats emotions like these abstract entities that only therapists are experts on dealing with. So it's kind of funny, right? Because here you've got a guy who's a psychotherapist. I mean, he comes through social work, but he is definitely a psychotherapist. That is his job. And the core ideas of his theory undermine or seem to undermine the need for therapy, right? Because he's telling us that the only reason that people think they need therapists to help them deal with emotions is because therapists have kind of bound together and put forth this idea that we're the people who can help with emotions. Now, again, I've said it a couple times, there's a little bit of irony in his perspective, more than a little bit of irony in his perspective. So, how ridiculous is it, the idea that clients can display emotions, but only therapists understand what emotions really mean. So DeShazer is not of that mindset. He is not of the mindset that people need to come to us to have their emotions explained to them. And so what are the implications of this prominent positioning of phenomenology and social constructs? What are the implications in the real world of clients and the therapeutic relationship? So what the idea behind this slide is that you've got the counselor-therapist relationship, and each party in the relationship has their own idea about what's going on. I'm trying to think where these specific examples were pulled from. I think it was a study in which clients and therapists separately were questioned about what they felt like their role was in therapy that had just been completed. And the therapist might have said, oh, well, I was a consultant, I implemented some interventions, I did some paraphrasing, I looked for strengths and other resources that the person brought to the table, and I listened and I gave ideas. The client, on the other hand, their experience of the counseling relationship was that the counselor was a mediator, a friend, somebody to bounce ideas off of, someone who made suggestions, and someone who was a savior to them at times. And now the idea here is just to highlight that in terms of physics, space-time continuum, these two people have the same experience. However, when they went back and looked at it, they really passed through two separate realities. And this can stretch to kind of clinical specifics. The therapist might have thought, assess the situation with the client and kind of determined, well, there was a divorce, there were multiple relationships, death in the family, and the mother came in worried about how this death impacted her son. Whereas the client is in a much more dire place. The client feels it was an emergency for me when I brought my son in. I was concerned about his out-of-control behavior. Well, and you could see how these two accounts are pretty radically different, but could pertain to the same events, right? Therapists could see depressive symptoms, panic disorder, marital discord, whereas the client thinks in terms of panic, family stressors, and the son's problems. So there's some overlap here, right? And then there's also some divergence. So if we try and think of things in terms of a unified reality, according to this perspective, if we try and think of things in terms of a unified reality, we're already on the wrong track. Because trying to pin it down to a common understanding is not going to be fruitful. If we were to take the theory to the logical extreme. So how does it work? What does it look like? Well, let's ask the SFBT co-developer, Kim In-Soo Berg. Remember, she's Steve DeShazer's partner and spouse. So if you guys could pause this, and there's just a quick, it's like a literally 2-minute video clip under the module that I've embedded there. Click that and then come on back here, and we'll take a brief look. We're almost done. There's just a couple more slides in this presentation. Take a brief look at what In-Soo Berg says. Go ahead and do that. Excellent. All right, I'm assuming that you all are coming back now from having looked at that little clip. I know it's kind of a grainy, weird video, but it for some reason it always kind of gets me in this way. There's some power in the ideas that she shares, I think. So what constructs, and the word construct is important here, what constructs does she identify that are common to other counseling models? And what might deconstructing these constructs say about solution focused? Well, she kind of takes a shot at the medical model. She looks at the label symptoms, the term that we use to describe people's discomfort, categories, diagnoses, accuracy, treatment, expertise. Well, these are all kind of ideas that are rooted in positivism. So In-Soo Berg, and more broadly SFBT and postmodernism, wants us to not necessarily take these constructs as a given. They want us to understand that they are constructs, that they are ideas and things that we have made up as people, and we don't want to necessarily treat them as the defining reality. Does that make sense? And then we'll look more at some of the specific stuff next semester in terms of interventions, but what might this do in a general way? If we think of the video clip with In-Soo Berg, if a client comes in and they are heavily ashamed about something and they don't want to share it, and you or In-Soo Berg or any therapist says, you know what, we don't even have to talk about that. Well, how's that going to work for implementing common factors? It might work pretty well, right? Because that person may have had a whole bunch of dread and you just kind of cut them loose from that. How's it going to help them in terms of feeling stigmatized or pathologized? Well, it's likely to depathologize them, because then all of a sudden they don't necessarily feel like coming to therapy is about something being wrong with them. What's it going to do for resistance? The idea that people might be in therapy, but they're not really ready to do anything. Well, it kind of ameliorates it. It kind of lessens it, because what the client sees is they're not really going to find somebody to battle with in you. That you're not positioning yourself to debate them. All of these things together could do a nice job of providing a positive orientation to the therapy. And how this happens, largely, is through a shift in language and an understanding that how people use language and the social realities that they create by using language are inextricably linked to concrete and practical circumstances. And that is all I want to share with you guys about this. It has been a fantastic semester. I know we'll be talking back and forth via email as we wrap things up. But I do want to thank you for listening to the end here and for being part of the course. Of course, contact me if you have any questions or concerns at all.